This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound, A New Planet. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And we are back again for a midweek bonus edition of Judaism Unbound, in which we are trying to do a little bit of futurism. That's just Lex and me trying to think through some of what we're experiencing in the immediate term here during the coronavirus pandemic situation, and thinking about how that affects Judaism, how that might affect Judaism in the future. We're sort of trying to get the regular episodes, the regular Friday episodes of Judaism Unbound back on a regular schedule, meaning that it's not all coronavirus all the time. Some of the weeks in the immediate present are people where we are talking in some more immediate way about the virus and its implications. So we're not quite there yet where we're completely getting Judaism Unbound off of coronavirus. And I'm not really sure that we should really aspire to get there anytime soon, in the sense that, of course, that's the most pressing thing on people's minds. And it might sound a little strange to go somewhere else. And yet we also have some other ideas of topics that we've been excited to explore for a long time, and we want to have a chance to go back to those. So I think we're going to be kind of easing our way back there. We have some interesting interviews scheduled that are not directly related to the coronavirus. And, I think we're going to get our way towards having topic areas on the regular Judaism Unbound that are not necessarily related to this. And at least for a while, as long as there's still a lot to think about and as long as there's still demand for it, I think we're going to do these midweek episodes where Lex and me, and maybe sometimes we'll have a guest, would talk about what we're experiencing now and try to do some of that futurism. So that's the plan. And I guess I will start by just saying that, Lex, I kind of want to pick up a little bit of where we were towards the end of last week's bonus episode, which is that we were framing this idea that, you have raised in the past, and you corrected me, you've raised in the past as that imagine a Jewish city, or imagine a city in which 13 million Jews live, not necessarily a Jewish city. Imagine a city in which 13 million Jews live. What would the institutions that we would build in that city be? And that might be a way into this question of what could a Jewish future look like, in which geography meant a lot less because the internet allows people to be in the same space in an interesting way that was not possible before. I want to go a little bit further than that today, where we started to go last time, which was to talk about this idea of a Jewish planet. Because or let's say, again, not a Jewish planet necessarily. By the way, you can read a science fiction book called Hyperion to learn a little bit more about a potential Jewish planet. But really to think about the idea that, unlike the framing that we might have given about digital Judaism in the past, where it was saying, like you've said really eloquently, that the difference between the migration of the Jews from Eastern Europe to America is that most of them could never go back to Eastern Europe after they came to America. In a digital migration, it's not an either-or situation. We migrate to the digital landscape for certain kinds of experiences, and our bodies still remain in our home landscape in whatever town our body lives in for other kinds of experiences. And some of those experiences can be intermixed, and some of them might just be separate kinds of experiences. In the coronavirus situation, we are actually perhaps in the situation that is more analogous to the migration from Eastern Europe to America, where, we might be able to go back and hopefully we will, in certain ways at least, after some period of time, and we don't know how long that period of time is, but at least for the time being, we're only in the digital space, or almost only. And that potentially raises all kinds of new possibilities. And I think that the order of talking this through is to say, what are the new possibilities that this complete digital migration allows, at least in the short term? And then I think we would want to say, well, about some of those things that may be the most exciting or perhaps the most problematic, what does that look like when the coronavirus is over? And at least the opportunity is there to return in some fashion to things the way they were. So I think, Lex, I'd like to start by playing around a little bit more with this idea of the Jewish planet, which feel free to revise if I haven't laid it out very well. And I'm sorry I keep calling it the Jewish planet. You know what I mean? It's a new planet that Jews have.
I actually am okay. I'll say why, but I'm not uncomfortable with that.
Okay. So in any event, one way or the other, it's some new planet that the Jews have migrated to and are having to build Jewish life anew. And fundamentally, the question is, would we build the same institutions that we had on Earth on this new Jewish planet?
Yeah. So first, I want to say why I'm comfortable with the language of Jewish planet. I think about it in the same way that I talk about, like, quote unquote Jewish languages. Like, I'm of the opinion that any language can be a Jewish language, and that Jewish language is not equivalent to saying a language that is spoken mostly by Jews or exclusively by Jews. So I'm comfortable saying that, like, English is a Jewish language, even though the vast majority of people who speak English are not Jews. When I would say, like, Jewish planet, I'm not saying that all 13 million people there are Jews. I am saying that 13 million of the people there are Jews. There's lots and lots and lots of other people there. Billions that are inhabiting the Jewish internet and the internet. Billions are inhabiting the internet. Millions are inhabiting the Jewish internet. So I'm basically, that's a long little rant. I'm comfortable with Jewish planet for that reason, if we use it in that way. So let's do the imagining. What do we think should exist for these 13 million people plus those adjacent to them? We always got to remember that there's their loved ones that are also participating in this Jewish space who might not be Jewish, their friends who might be participating in this space. Many of us already have had folks who aren't Jewish at our seders, so they're inhabiting this city too. Okay. The first thing I'd say is one thing is abundantly clear. In a city with 13 million Jews and whatever number, but a lot of Jewish institutions or organizations, it is incumbent on each institution or organization, or even just group of people, if it's not an organization, but just like a group that hangs out, it is incumbent upon each of them to kind of fill a specific niche or role. And that, to me, that's just sort of basic. We know this, and this is part of why I like the city metaphor, like a smaller scale. Like, if any city had multiple Jewish options that were super close to each other, you and I would be the first ones to start advocating for merging. Like, and we're seeing that, by the way, all around we're seeing that there are places where they might have, I mean, sometimes it's two synagogues of the same denomination that might.
You're saying we're seeing that in the pre-coronavirus world,
right? Yeah. But other times it's not even just that they share denominations; it's just that they're serving similar people. And so I would that is accelerated because we not only do we have 13 million people in this city. All the people have done that migration that you talked about, but also something that didn't happen with whether it's Europe to the US or anywhere else to the US. I don't want to just be like Europe said, but like imagine if all of the, whether it's synagogues, whether it's just groups of people learning together, imagine if all of those also took the boat over. Like, that's happened too. And so we have this huge surplus. And so my question is, okay, forgetting what currently exists, if I were setting up, if I or we were setting up a situation for millions upon millions of Jews, one thing you've said that I think is important is that the number of institutions, projects, convenings that we need is not just, we had 10,000 or 100,000 Jews in a city before. So if we have 13 million, we find the factor that those are different from. So 10,000, I guess it would be times, what is it, 100? You'd multiply by 1,300. So we need 1,300 times more Jewish institutions to reach those many people. Like, that's not how that works. We need to consider that nobody can keep track of that many institutions. And so we'd have to say, okay, we want to have these kinds of, I'm going to say, spiritual or meaning-making options. I'm not saying we need to have Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. I'm saying we need to have meaning-making devices, and it's not clear to me that the way we separate out those meaning-making devices will resemble the way we separate it out in the existing communities.
And I just want to point out that is already the case. Like meaning that there, I haven't done the counting, but I know that there are not, that in New York compared to, let's say, Columbia, South Carolina, where my family lives, there are however many orders of magnitude more Jews in New York, but there are not that many order of magnitudes more Jewish institutions in New York, even in New York, where we think that there's so many. It's just, of course, you don't need that many. All the more so if there's 13 million Jews in one place.
Yeah, I mean, we could break down. Yeah, that might be a good thing for us to do. Actually, I mean, there's what, like 1 million. I think it's like 1 million Jews in New York City, and so if we were to, even Providence, which is a bigger, like Providence has like 20,000 Jews. That would be for every Providence institution 50 New York ones, and that is not the case. Like Providence has a couple dozen. Like I know that would not be the way it is. We've even in New York distilled or I don't know, but so basically what I'm getting at is I want us to think about, okay, how could we build a Jewish planet or Jewish city or Jewish internet where we look out at the different projects and we say, this one is filling this specific need. We understand that we're all in the same place, so we don't need. I still think we're conceptualizing things through the lens of the cities, the countries even that were around beforehand. Now, there are still time zones. So on some level, we do actually need to duplicate some things for people that are like on opposite sides of the globe and awake at different times if this stuff is live. But besides that, we don't need to have multiple of everything. So I would say, okay, so we need to have really amazing, for now, maybe it's still a couple dozen, honestly. Maybe it's still a bunch because we're figuring it out and we're experimenting. Like maybe we need a couple dozen of each kind of meaning-making modality. So that would be, Shabbat services. That would be Torah studies, learnings. That would be cultural events and the kinds of stuff that happens at the JCC. That would be Jewish studies classes and like academic learnings, which I think sometimes we equate with Torah studies, but they're very different. And we could keep rolling with this, but music, different kinds of music, everything from, a Joe Buchanan country Western Jewish singer to a klezmer band to the beautiful music of the Abayudaya Uganda community that's caught on in some places. Like, okay, so we have a couple dozen of each of those. We shouldn't have a couple hundred of each of those, because the second you have that, and I'm giving a preview of Lila Corwin-Berman's episode, which hasn't come out yet, but which we recorded, it gets overwhelming. She said there's just so much stuff. And I think that that's true. And so the question is, how can we have a smaller amount of stuff, but really do it thoughtfully so that it's high quality and each thing sort of is meeting a different niche, almost like an ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I'm thinking about the show Unorthodox that everybody, I know is watching these days on Netflix. And it's like, it feels like the response of the normal way that like the Jewish community works would be like, oh, wow, people are really into this show, Unorthodox on Netflix. So every station should be making shows about ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's like, then the market is flooded, and then, nobody's going to want to watch those anymore after a while. I
sometimes feel like we're doing that.
Yeah, no, we are. For sure we are.
On that issue specifically.
No, yeah. we are. So there's another piece, right, which I think is more realistic because it's very expensive to make actual television shows, right? But instead what we're seeing, and, we're part of this, is that everybody who can is trying to get somebody from Unorthodox to come and speak in their local online community, right? And so it's like, well, maybe it would just be fine if everybody went to hear, this person from Unorthodox in one place, and that would be it. It's like what is the extra advantage of having the, producer of Unorthodox talking to this JCC director versus that JCC director versus this Judaism Unbound host versus that Forward host? It's like, really what the thing should be is like, who is the best interviewer that's going to pull the most interesting information out of them? And then maybe that organization, instead of doing a 1 hour event, should do like a 3-part series or something to get the maximum out of this person, and then we can kind of say we did that, as a community, and people can be there live, they can watch it on tape, but instead we have this idea that like everybody should be scrambling to book this person. Now, that makes sense. That makes all the sense in the world in a physical world. Right, where, like I heard there was a great event with the producer of Unorthodox in New York. Let's bring that person to LA so we can have that, we can expose our people to that just as well. But now your people in LA are exposed just as well to the event in New York. So, like that's just an example of what that looks like. Now, the question is, this is not a critique of anyone, because first of all, I'm saying, like, I think we're we talked a little bit with Lila, you'll hear it next week, that, or later this week, that we're part of this. But, and so in the early days of something, there's all kinds of reasons why, it's not coordinated, and I don't think it should be coordinated, but at the same time, I think that what we're seeing right now is a short-term response to this shocking change. And the question that I think we're raising here is not necessarily what happens as soon as the Jews land on this new planet. Because I think as soon as the Jews land on this new planet, everybody starts trying to create what do they call it? The synagogues, like Landsman something, Landsman, Landsmanschaft or something. There were these, meaning that in the early days, right after the Jews immigrated to the United States, there were all these synagogues that were founded, in particular in New York, that are kind of the, like the Hungarian synagogue and the Polish synagogue and the whatever, and they were like sliced and diced in these really narrow ways that now when you go on a tour of like Jewish New York, it's almost like laughable that there's a street where, here's the Hungarian and here's the Polish synagogue, and they're all shuttered, more or less. They're all in a state of disrepair because the second generation said, how am I any different? But my ancestors came from Poland and then this person's ancestors came from Hungary. Like, why should we pray in 2 different synagogues if more or less the service is similar and, it's very expensive to maintain these buildings and everything? So, I think realistically it takes a period of time to get these things. So I wouldn't have criticized the people who created the Hungarian shul, and I'm not criticizing anybody who's booking the head of, the producer of Unorthodox for their local JCC's event. The question that I'm sort of asking is what's going to be, or what should be in 3 months or 3 years from now. And I think that what will be and should be is a consolidation of where these things are offered to, and I hope that the consolidation will be based on who's doing the best job. And I hope that we'll be around, meaning like I hope we're doing the best job or one of the best jobs, but like we might not be, and in which case, we won't be around or we won't be doing this anymore. And so I think that the question, I would go back to this question of the Jewish planet and say, like, look, here's a way to think about it. In the early 20th century, we had these various shuls in New York of all the different communities and everything. If you would have asked any of those people what would you think should be in a JCC, they would be like, what is a JCC? It stands for Jewish Community Center. And they're like, okay, what is that? And yet today, if we sort of talk about the landscape of early 21st century American Judaism, we would say, oh, well, there's a JCC in every city. There's a federation in every city. There's whatever features there might be, a JCRC, a Jewish Community Relations Council in every city, right? There's these things that we can say, hey, well, this is what defines a Jewish city in America, a city that has a substantial Jewish presence, is that it would have these features. And almost all of those features would not have been understandable to your average Jew 100 years ago. And so the question is, and the reason for that is not just because Judaism changed. It's because Judaism, in my opinion, I think this is right, is because Judaism moved to a new geography, and that the things that were built that kind of mirrored the old geography didn't make it more than a generation. And the new things that were more organic to America are the things that really took off and grew. And, including the reform movement, the conservative movement, for example. And so the question here is that if we take seriously the idea of migration, then really the question is, I would start to ask, what are the new initiatives that are digital only or digital primary that either existed before the coronavirus and that have a chance to accelerate now because they're of renewed relevance? And then what are things that might be created that are really responsive to this new landscape to which we have migrated? And I would start to predict that those are the things that are going to be around in X years in some new version, but those are the early stage versions of what's going to be around. Whereas anybody who's online trying to replicate what existed before the migration, my prediction is that those are the things that are going to actually, they might be really successful right away, but they're not going to last very long.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think it's how we define replicate kind of looms large here, because I think there's some forms of replicating things. So like, I'm thinking of like our quarantine book club with the Jewish Women's Archive. So in a sense, that is replicating something that was existing before, because people did have book clubs. I don't know how many people had specifically Jewish book clubs. Some do, and some institutions have offered that, but certainly a lot of people have book clubs. And then we created a digital book club that meets once a week and brings really high quality authors. And there's been hundreds of people coming. And by the way, I actually think that that's small for like, I think that it potentially could be much bigger, because when you zoom out and you think, okay, if there's 300 and some people in this, because we have the chat open during these programs, and everybody says where they're from, like where they're physically located. Like that's, if you have 300 people, that's a couple people in a lot of small and mid-sized communities. And maybe there's 10 or 15 in New York, and maybe there's 8 in Chicago. I mean, I'm making up numbers, but like it's potentially much, much larger. But what I think, so I think that in a sense that's replicating, but it's mostly not. Like it's something that it wasn't a central institution of Jewish life outside of the internet. But the first few days of the pandemic, we realized like this might potentially be something that works really well in this new modality. So in a sense, it's replicating, in a sense, it's not. I just want to complicate it a little. What I also want to say is, I want to underscore, highlight, emphasize what you said about how, I mean, I'm paraphrasing you a little bit, but you said that, we made the Hungarian synagogue, we made the Polish synagogue, like, and what I took away from what you said is, we thought that the category lines, we thought that the dividing lines that separate, and I'm not saying separate in like the terrible sense. I'm just saying like there are always categories within larger groups. And we thought that the categories were sort of eternally Galicianer. I mean, I'm going to use words that like might not mean anything to people. Like Hungarian, like these places in Europe. And even to this day, I sometimes hear people allude to like stereotypical associations with some of those specific European groups. But I think most folks in Jewish communities at this point, like, don't even get what that's communicating. Like if somebody references a yeka, I think like a lot of people actually just don't know what that means in a way that 50 years ago they would have.
And it means a German Jew.
Right. And so, I mean, part of why I do it is like specifically because it was mysterious, but I appreciate you defining. But like, I think that in the same way, and this might feel nuts to us, I think reform, conservative, the delineations that are to us are like so basic. Reform, conservative, like that's how Jewish communities have generally, when you ask questions about what type of Jew people are, the answers are reform, conservative, just Jewish, modern Orthodox, like all of those words. Like it's not clear to me that means very much digitally. So first off, I want to say why. Like the second you have more and more of these communities, including some that identify as conservative, I don't think yet modern Orthodox, but maybe someday, using this technology on Shabbat, like that was one major distinguishing line before. Like if I go to a Reform synagogue, it's because I might relate to technological observance and Shabbat in this way. If I go to the conservative one, it might be because I do it in this way. Like if that's gone, then the line between Reform and conservative on one axis is blurred. I think there's other ways that it will be blurred too. And I think mostly people are just looking for engaging experiences. And I think that in a digital world, it's less important to me, at least, and I think to a lot of people, once you isolate the community parts, like once you isolate I know people in this room from before, and it's just like, here's a couple dozen spaces I could go to. I don't think for a lot of people, which space they go to is going to be dictated by whether it's Reform or conservative. I think it's going to be by who finds the best ways to utilize this technology to create the most meaningful experiences. And by the way, it could be that in a few decades, we have new, like, in quotes, denominations or streams. Streams is a funny word here, live stream, but like new relationships to Judaism that are built around distinctions of how we do stuff digitally. It could be that there's a stream of Judaism that arises that really is about some of the interactive room style Zooms. I don't know, like people being in the same space, seeing each other all at once, and interacting in that way. And maybe another stream of Judaism is where it's more broadcast style, Facebook Live, where, like, I'm making this up, but some kind of distinction that is unique to this space. In the same way, by the way, that Reform conservative, like they started in Germany, I will concede, but in many ways, how those movements evolved and how they're distinguished from each other are a specifically American phenomenon. You go to Argentina, you ask people, are you Reform or conservative? It's like, well, we have sort of different, like, it's complicated and those are you go to England, there's both liberal and Reform. It's like a different set of things. Like people create their own separatenesses based on their context. So that's going to happen. And the last thing I'd say, and this goes back to the Quarantine Book Club, I think we're doing something intuitive, but maybe off, because what we've been, not we, like when we analogize X, Y, or Z pre-pandemic event to a digital event, we might be missing the whole picture. So it would be easy to look at an individual instance of our Quarantine Book Club where somebody is talking to 350 people about their book as comparable to a book reading at the bookstore or at the synagogue or whatever. I actually think it's more comparable to the book tour, the whole thing. Because what happens is, look, even for these wonderful books with really high quality people, most of the time they set up a tour, they go to, 10 places around the country, whatever, and each one probably gets 25, 30, 40, like maybe 50 in a really great situation people. In one moment, we're getting that many. And once again, I think this has the potential to grow much more. We're getting all of the people that might have gone to any of those events anywhere at once. And so my question is, if we thought about it as like what would change if we thought about it as like a transgeographic tour in 1 hour versus like sort of a mapped version of the book reading, where then you're going to do 10 of those online in different corners. I don't know. Well,
a lot would have to change, because I think that, I don't know, I'm not super inside of book marketing, but I think that part of the ideas of having a book tour is that you build buzz over time. And, if you have like a one-shot thing, then that's going to have a lot of interesting impact. So, and that's part of why I think it's at least worth considering that nothing that's happening digitally right now is all that important. That's another piece that I think is worth considering. That meaning that nothing that's happening digitally right now is going to be the real source of the thing that's going to be happening digitally in 2 years from now and even 2 months from now. And that we're iterating towards something new here, and we don't really know what it's going to look like. And that's where I think that I have real concern that folks who are looking around are just kind of trying to measure what's not there. I've used the analogy before of the idea, right, that sort of jokey story of the person who lost his wallet and he's looking for it over here, and somebody asked him, where did you lose it? And he said, about a mile down the road. And he said, well, why are you looking here? And the answer is, because this is where the streetlights are. And of course that's absurd, and yet that's what we do all the time. That we ask about what kind of responses it's getting, and the answer is that it does matter. But what it matters in is it pointing into a direction that is promising. But the idea that whatever you're doing right now should remain exactly the same in this highly accelerated environment is not. It doesn't make any sense. And I worry that a lot of this is the old disruptive innovation story, that a lot of things are going to be smothered in the cradle that could have grown into the thing that really we need. I want to just reinforce one thing that you said, because I think it's super important. What if we think about conservative and reform and whatever other sort of identity marker you're using to come into this new space? What if we think of all of those as directly analogous to Hungarian, Lithuanian, Polish, meaning that they all are just relating to before? And they're not going to make any sense for much longer. And by the way, again, I want to be really clear that from my perspective, this is not because of the coronavirus. This is accelerated by the coronavirus. But we've been saying these things for the whole span of the podcast. And I think that they were true before we started the podcast. They were true while we were doing the podcast, and they're true now even more so. And, one of the pieces that I want to just talk about briefly, because I think it'll be something that we might want to talk about later, is that I think that a lot of people imagine that when the virus is over, we're just going to go back and sort of pick up things where they were. And I don't think that's going to happen for two reasons. One is that I think the virus situation is going to last much longer than people are thinking. Even if it's a little bit relaxed, it's still going to be like basically not going to allow. For example, like there's not going to be regular high holiday services this fall. It's just not going to happen. If you can have it in person at all, it's going to be highly socially distanced, meaning that only a subset of the number of people who could have come will be able to come. So in all events, you're going to have to either have a digital component to it, or it's going to be all digital. And I don't think people are even thinking about that. Some people are, for sure. But I mean, I think that the vast majority of folks are hoping that that's not going to be the case. But it is going to be the case. The other thing that I really want to focus on here, though, is that if we're back to this question of a Jewish planet, and this is the email that we got in response to last week's conversation, was that I think that we're talking largely still about content. And we haven't talked that much yet about two other elements, and I'd love to hear from emails from people from other elements that we haven't talked about. One is community, and the other is let's say, creativity, meaning that it's all well and good to say that content is, and by content, I mean whether it's Jewish learning or services or any kind of experience, that we are saying that the number of, let's say, content creators or content providers at scale, meaning for dozens or more of people at once, that number is going to reduce. And now that people can access that content from all over the world, right, those content creators ostensibly could have much larger a number of people that are joining them than they ever had before. And we're seeing that online. We're seeing that, for example, really dramatically in streaming services, that the synagogues and other prayer services that are doing this job really well are seeing severely increased numbers of people that are participating. And that suggests that some of them may have not been going to any services before, but my guess is that a lot of those people were going to services somewhere else and are now going to services at these really great streaming places. And so we're going to see a consolidation there and fewer content producers creating better and better content that's going to be more and more widely shared. But what about community? What happens to communities of the people who are now in these huge streaming service experiences? Like, what kind of community experience are they having? And I think that there's two pieces to mention about that. Number one, they weren't necessarily having such good community experiences before. And that is probably the most important point to make about it. That a lot of the people who are fretting about this are the very tiny minority of Jews who were having a very positive community experience before this. And I would refer you to Erwin Kula's episodes of Judaism Unbound. I think they were episode 53 and 54. I think maybe I don't remember which one. I think it was 53 where he talks about this. And he said in very dramatic language, like, that was a fake community, when he was talking about synagogues. That was fake, because most of the members of a synagogue are not part of the community, don't feel part of the community in a in a real way. I mean, they might feel part of something in the sense that they understand that there are certain ways in which they are included, but they're not really experiencing what we see as the good, the individual good of community through this relationship with the synagogue. They're not really getting that. There's a very tiny number of people that come every Shabbat, very, very tiny number of people that stay for Kiddush, and that are having this like very intense community experience. And in a synagogue of, hundreds of member units, so to speak, you might have a couple dozen, maybe 50 people that are really getting that level of experience out of it. So one piece to note is that it wasn't so great on the other end of it. The other piece to note is that a lot of the people, Here's the brutal facts of reality. We talked about last time the Stockdale principle, that the brutal facts of reality are that a lot of the people are not going to be going back on the other end of this because they will have lost the habit of synagogue membership, of JCC membership, of even Federation giving. They will have lost a lot of these habits, and they will realize, I never really was getting anything out of that in the first place. By the way, a lot of people are not going to join gyms on the other end of this because they're going to have gotten out of the habit of that I should be doing this thing. So a lot of synagogues are going to have to close and fold and merge simply because people are not going back. And the question will still be, like, what is happening to those communities? Really, sadly, unfortunately, they're going to be lost. And maybe in the merged entity, people will build new communities. But a lot of what was before is not going to be back. Now let's talk about the question of, and this is where you may be the bigger expert, how to build community from the position of a digital place. Like, and what might we do going forward? I mean, what should we be doing with Jewish Live? And what might anybody listening to say, okay, I get it. Now we really have to, now we focus on content for the first couple of months. Now we have to turn to community. What do we start to do?
Yeah, so this is big. Okay, a couple things. One, the more we talk about this, the more I really think the migration analogy, where we compare this to previous migrations, is really important. I think that we're doing the nostalgia thing already. We're doing the thing where, and by the way, this isn't just a thing that American Jews did where they looked back at Europe and said, everything was so good and everybody was immersed in Jewish culture and everybody was literate and everybody studied Torah and everybody like that wasn't true. But like it's the same as the Egypt. We just left Egypt a few years ago and like maybe it wasn't so bad. Like it's not just an Ashkenazi normative.
At least we were slaves, but at least we had community.
Right. And we're doing that same thing. I hear so many people like, and by the way, I think you're right. It's the minority of people who felt most included in those spaces that we were used to before this pandemic who are saying this. Now, there's, I think, a much higher percentage of those people in the digital spaces that have been created because we are mapping them to be like those existing spaces. But anyway, I think that nostalgia piece is happening in the same way. That's number one. Number two, let's hone in on your question. Like, how do we do this? And I think that it's another thing that's really similar to on the ground communities. Community doesn't happen in the Shabbat service. Community doesn't happen even in the high holiday service. Community doesn't happen in the central things. Community happens in between. Community happens when people bring food to someone's Shiva who they don't know that well, but they do it because that's something that their community stands for. Community happens when the newbie joins and somebody invites them to coffee. Community happens when there's the informal dinner where people go out after services and they invite the new person. The community, it's all of the in-betweens. And we're not doing the in-between so much online, and that's to be expected. It's totally overwhelming to think about how, wait, we're gonna do learning and social programming and services and everything, and we're gonna have to like create ways for people to interact in between all those. It's like it's a 24/7 ask. And by the way, community, if it actually exists in a real way that supports not only the most centered people, is also a 24/7 ask offline. Like we think that it just sort of appears, but it's a really intense effort. And what I'd say on that is so first off, we've talked about this before. This is not a new thing, but evangelical Christian communities have some stuff to teach on this. Like You tell that story about how there's the people who on Sundays in these massive mega churches are like the greeters, and you ask them like, well, what do you do? Like, when's your meeting? When's your service? And they said Wednesdays. Like a totally different time, because it is so important to have people specifically delineated just only as welcomers of others, that they are actually sacrificing. I
Yes.
kind of like the religious imagery of the term sacrifice. They're sacrificing their experience on one day for the sake of others. Like, what would it mean if there were people during the webinar of the service or of the Torah study who they were actually not particularly paying attention to the content? They were just reaching out to people who have questions in the chat, fielding those questions, encouraging them to learn more, sending them links, do it. Like, what if there were people who were that kind of experience facilitator? And on that front, what if we really took the advice of Jethro, which we've been talking about in a variety of ways? What if we really took that seriously and said, oh, it's not so, like this teaching that Jethro gives about, we need to set up captains of 50 and captains of 10. I'm getting whatever the numbers are. You have to set
Tens,
up
50s, hundreds, and thousands.
Yeah, of each level of community size, big size, medium, little. Like, what if it's not about the captains? What if it's not about like, this is how you set up a hierarchy. You need to like have people, like it's a very top down thing. What if it's just people have needs of feeling a sense of community only with 10 people? There is something that when you're in a Zoom room, now we're back in digital, like when you're with 10 people and not 50, there are a set of things that happen in that room that don't happen in the 50. There are also things that happen in the 50. That's the teacher. There's the 10s, there's the 50s, there's the 500s, whatever. And I think if our goal, and look, I'm not just screaming this at everybody else. We also haven't done a good job of this. Like, if our takeaway with the Quarantine Book Club, which does have hundreds of people, was, you know what, this is good, but those people that are coming probably would love to have a space that is a different day, that they can just hang out with 8 people and really dig deep into what thoughts and curiosities came up in the previous conversation. That would probably be great. If we created that, that's where the community is going to happen. Having a sense of affiliation where a bunch of people go to the same thing weekly, that's nice, but it's affiliation. It's not community. Those are different. Being a member of a community, being affiliated with it is not the same as being a community member. Like that has to be different. Being a community member is a set of obligations and support mechanisms and intimacies that require, and honestly, it's not even just groups of 8, it's groups of 2 and 3. So let's do that.
Well,
too.
like just to, yeah, and I think we're getting towards our end of our time, and we want to wrap up. I definitely want to pick up on this stuff next week on the community, and then to get to the creativity stuff. But I was thinking about the Jewish Planet as you were talking, and I'm thinking, like, let's say, like, there's a really interesting thing happening on Jewish Live, which is that Wilderness Torah, which is an organization that's sort of, based on the earth and the outdoors and all that stuff, is doing, like, an amazing job creating digital content. And I'm thinking about this, and you wouldn't have thought so, right? I mean, who would have thought that the Earth-based organization is the one who's going to embrace digital in the most profound way? Not only are they doing great content, they're doing it 4 days a week. They started as 3 days a week. They asked, could we add a 4th day? And, from my perspective, you guys, you can add a 7th day. You do it all the time, But they're doing an amazing job. And I'm thinking about this planet. And what if there was it's a planet where you have to wear a spacesuit to go outside. And so there are people who love the outdoors and who love the planet. They want to make community. Well, in the past, they might have been able to go to the outdoors and, hug each other and, kind of sing in a certain way. But now they have to go outdoors wearing a spacesuit. I think eventually on that planet, you would end up with outdoors communities, right? And people would figure out how to do community through spacesuits. Like we can't quite imagine it right now, right? But they would figure it out. And so eventually, 100 years later, people would, in some way, it would be so good that people would look back to those days when we had the thing that we now would say is the superior form of community. And they would say, what a tragic time that was when these communities were so small. And, they were, you could only be with people who lived in your own city. I mean, how crazy is that? Right. And so I think that what I want to go back to your Jethro comment as a conclusion, because I would just put out there how I feel about this as somebody who's trying to respond to this crisis and to try to build a new project within an organization that's responsive to this crisis, and that we have focused on content and not so much yet on community. And I'm feeling about it like I want to focus on community. I want that to be part of what we're doing. And what Jethro really, comes in the book of Exodus, I think it's chapter 18, Jethro visits Moses and he gives him all kinds of advice. The most famous is this idea of this, what's thought of as a pyramidal leadership structure with captains of tens and captains of 50s and captains of hundreds. I agree with what you said, that the captains is less the point than the fact that people need to be in a community of 10 to feel like held. And they need to be probably in a community of 50 to feel like they have purpose. And they need to be in a community of 100 to feel like, whatever other virtue. So that is part of Jethro's advice that's really important. The challenge is the captains come in a different way that I feel, and I think, and I don't mean me as a person, I mean we as an organization are basically completely overwhelmed just trying to get the content out that we have and to get people to know about it and all of that. If you come to us and say, hey, we need to build community, I start to panic. It feels like I know it's true. And I start to feel like, what am I supposed to do? And so I think the answer is that we do have to find these captains. And I'm thinking hard about it these days. And I'm putting out a call to our listeners a little bit to say that right now we don't have the funds to hire captains of community. I would love to be able to find those funds. So if somebody has any access to funds, let us know. But more profoundly, I think I'm not talking about funds. I'm talking about volunteers. And I think it would be really amazing if we could start to build a structure of volunteer captains who go out there and help organize people into community and figure out what community means. So if you're out there and you're a person who says, ideally, I could imagine myself as like a captain of 1,000, right? Meaning like a volunteer coordinator. We would love to talk to you. If you're a person out there who says, I would love to be a captain of 10, we would like to have an email from you. We might not have time to talk to you right away, but as soon as we get that volunteer coordinator, they will, right? So I guess I want to suggest out there that now is the time to start to raise your hand if you are interested and potentially have the time and bandwidth to be part of some kind of reimagined community through this particular interest area, right? We talked about like it's not going to be the Hungarians and the Poles and the Lithuanians. It's not going to be the conservative and the reform. It may be the Jewish unbound listening world and other types of markers of identity. And at least within the Judaism Unbound Jewish Live world, I would like to put out there that we really want to bring this part of things online. And we also want to bring another element online that we're going to talk about next week, which is the creativity side of things. So I'd like people to start thinking about whether they have the capacity to help us build out that part of what we're doing.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I would love for that to be something we build. I also think that just all of us informally in the various events that we're going to can look for little openings to take on that kind of role. In the same way that, people say it's trite at this point, everybody's on the welcoming committee. Like, like if you are relatively familiar with the internet and Zoom and digital modality, like you are ahead of a lot of people that you're sharing a space with at a given point. So what would it look like for you, and I'm saying this not just to you, like what would it look for me in events that are not Jewish Live events where I'm not like responsible for them, for me to just sort of own, okay, I'm somebody who's going to play a role to try and be there for the person that is less comfortable right now, to try and help the person who doesn't know how to screen share when the host asks for people to share a picture of whatever, who doesn't know where the chat is, or who does, but like is unconfident for one reason or another. Like, I think that's something that we can do informally in addition to like finding actual roles in the way that you described. So we are going to close out. Thank you to everybody for viewing this if you're viewing live. And just shameless shout out, but you can watch live in the future. We go live Mondays at 9 a.m. Eastern time. But if you're listening on the podcast, that's amazing too. And you'll be able to listen for, perpetuity as far as we know. But we're going to close out, and the ways that you can be in touch with us are as follows. First, there is our Facebook page, well, our multiple Facebook pages, Jewish Live, all one word, and Judaism Unbound. Second, there are actually, before I do second, there's also our Facebook group, Jewish Live Connect, which is a good place for some of the in-between kinds of community that we're talking about. You can't post, but you can comment on anything there, and there's been a lot of really great back and forth in some of the comments. There's also our Twitter feed, which is at Judaism Unbound. There's our websites, jewishlive.org and judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, there are our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com and lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial support that you can send our way. And you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate or jewishlive.org/donate. So thank you. And also, just seriously, we love hearing from people. We're not just throwing these websites and email addresses out for kicks. We really internalize what we hear, and we're trying to build as many of those notes as we can into these future conversations. So thank you so much. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound Live.